She left me a building, an orchid on the windowsill, and a retired stranger who knew everything she never got to tell me. I almost sold it. That's the first thing you need to understand about how this story starts. Not with courage or foresight or any particular instinct for opportunity. It starts with me sitting at my kitchen table in Cincinnati on a Thursday afternoon in March, still in the paint-stained jeans I'd worn to school, reading a certified letter I'd almost thrown away because I assumed it was a collections notice. My name is Maya Callahan. I'm 36 years old. I teach art to middle schoolers, which means I spend approximately 40% of my professional life convincing 12-year-olds that they are not, in fact, terrible at drawing. The other 60% is paperwork, parent emails, and trying to remember where I put my red pen. I make $51,000 a year. I have $4,200 in savings, $31,000 in student loans that I've been paying down with the enthusiasm of someone bailing out a rowboat with a teaspoon, and a 2014 Honda Civic with 119,000 miles that I speak to gently, the way you'd speak to an elderly relative you're not sure is tracking everything you say. I don't own anything. My parents rented their whole lives, apartment to apartment across the east side of Columbus, then finally a small house in Reynoldsburg that they rented until my father's back gave out and they moved in with my aunt. The concept of property ownership existed in my world the way the concept of sailing existed. Theoretically possible, logistically mysterious, almost certainly not for people like us. So when the certified letter told me that my grandmother, Eleanor May Callahan, age 89, had died on March 4th and left me a duplex in Columbus, Ohio, my first coherent thought was not gratitude. It was not grief, though that came later, complicated and weighted with 11 years of silence. My first thought was, how fast can I sell this? Eleanor and I hadn't spoken since I was 25. The falling out, I'm not going to trace every fault line here, had something to do with money she'd lent my cousin that I thought she should have offered to me first, and something to do with things I'd said that I couldn't unsay, and something to do with being 25, which is an age at which you can be extraordinarily certain and extraordinarily wrong in the same breath. It felt enormous at the time. It feels small now, in the way that things you can't take back always feel small once the person you take them back from is gone. I googled the address before I even finished reading the letter. The street view photo showed a two-story building on a wide, quiet street. Old houses, mature trees, the kind of neighborhood that had been working class for decades and was now at some transitional point you couldn't quite name. The duplex itself looked tired. Peeling paint on the trim, one front window on the upper unit patched with duct tape and plastic sheeting, a driveway with a crack running through it like a scar. The gutters on the south side had begun to pull away from the roofline. I called a real estate agent that same evening. Her name was Diane, she was cheerful and efficient, and she told me that in that condition, I was looking at $190,000, maybe $210,000. She said she could list it the following week. That's a quick close, I said, meaning, thank you, this is manageable, I can do this and go back to my life. Honey, in that neighborhood, it'll move in 10 days, she said. I told her I'd confirm by the weekend. I hung up feeling, and I want to be honest about this, relieved. Not like I'd found something. Like I'd figured out how to put something down. Update 1. The man at the door. I drove to Columbus on Saturday morning. I told myself I'd take a quick look, confirm the condition, maybe walk through with Diane, and get back to Cincinnati before dark. I had papers to grade. I had a moderate-sized anxiety about the whole situation that I was managing by keeping it in motion. The duplex was more worn down in person than the photo had suggested. The gutters were worse than I'd thought. The south side section had pulled a full 3 inches from the fascia board and was hanging at a dispirited angle. The yard on both sides hadn't been tended in what looked like 2 seasons. Someone had placed a blue plastic storage bin over a spot on the front porch that I didn't want to examine too closely. I stood on the driveway for a moment, looking at it. I thought about my grandmother, who I hadn't seen in 11 years, who had owned this building for, the letter had said, 31 years. Who had made decisions about this guttering and this driveway and this yard for 3 decades while I was finishing college and moving to Cincinnati and starting my career and building a life that I told myself was fine, was enough, was mine. I knocked on the downstairs unit. The man who opened the door was 67, maybe, with white hair and the kind of careful posture that suggested he'd once been taller and hadn't entirely forgiven the years for it. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was holding a mug of coffee. He looked at me for a moment, not unfriendly, but assessing, the way someone looks when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. "You must be Eleanor's granddaughter," he said. "She talked about you. Come in." His name was Gerald Okafor. He'd been living in the downstairs unit for 14 years. He had a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood and something faintly floral, a small orchid on the windowsill, which I noticed because my grandmother had kept orchids. He poured me a cup of coffee without asking whether I wanted one, and he sat across from me at a kitchen table covered in neat stacks of paper, and he told me about himself. 31 years in residential property management across central Ohio. Peak portfolio of over 200 units. He knew every contractor in Franklin County, every permit clerk, every zoning amendment from the last decade. He'd retired 4 years ago, genuinely retired, not forced out, because he was tired and because he'd done what he set out to do and because, as he put it with a slight smile, I wanted to drink my coffee at a table I didn't own and stop caring about someone else's roof. My grandmother had offered him the downstairs unit at $610 a month, far below market, as thanks for 15 years of informal advice. He'd helped her navigate a dispute with a contractor in 2009. He'd helped her understand the implications of a zoning change in 2014. He'd been, for a long time, her most reliable source of information about the things she owned but didn't always know how to manage. In exchange, she'd given him a quiet, cheap place to retire into. It was a fair arrangement. It was the kind of arrangement that doesn't get written down anywhere and only makes sense if you understand the full history. He asked me what I planned to do with the property. I told him I was planning to sell it. He nodded, slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected. What did the agent tell you? 190, maybe 210. He nodded again. Would you like to know what it's actually worth? Update 2, what he showed me. We spent 2 hours at that table. He refilled my coffee twice. He had a yellow legal pad, and he wrote numbers on it in a neat, unhurried hand, and he explained each one as though he'd been expecting to explain them for some time, which, I realized later, he had. The neighborhood had been quietly appreciating for 6 years. 3 new coffee shops, a brewery that had opened in a converted warehouse 4 blocks away, a bike lane project that had been approved by the city in 2022 and was halfway complete. The kind of slow, neighborhood-by-neighborhood shift that doesn't make headlines but absolutely makes property values. Not gentrification exactly, more like recalibration. The street we were sitting on had absorbed that shift steadily, and the duplex, for all its cosmetic issues, sat squarely in a zone that buyers and investors had been circling for 3 years. The upstairs unit had been vacant for 8 months. My grandmother had stopped renting it after a difficult tenant. Gerald described the situation briefly and without embellishment, and hadn't had the energy or the will to turn it over herself. She'd been managing the building alone, at 88, which is a sentence that took me a moment to sit with basic cosmetic repairs, and he was specific here: refinish the floors upstairs, replace the patched window, paint interior and exterior, fix the gutters, resurface the driveway, update the upstairs kitchen fixtures. He estimated $18,000 to $22,000 all in. He had a contractor he trusted who would give me an honest bid. After those repairs, both units would rent at market rate. Downstairs, $1,150 a month. Upstairs, $1,050. Total gross, $2,200 a month. $26,400 a year. Property taxes and insurance on a building like this ran about $4,100 a year. Net income, before maintenance reserves, $22,300 annually. He drew a line on the legal pad and wrote below it: market value, repaired and rented, $310,000 to $330,000. I looked at that number for a long time. The agent, I said. She would have listed it at 190. She would have had it under contract in a week, he said, and collected her 3%, and you would have thought you did something smart. He said this without hostility. Just evenly. You would have paid off your student loans and had money left over and gone home to Cincinnati, and that would have been the end of it. And that's not nothing. But it's not what this building is worth. I want to describe what happened inside me in that moment, but I don't entirely have the language for it. It wasn't that the money changed shape, though it had, dramatically. It was something about the way he said what this building is worth. Like the building had a value that existed independent of my fear of it. Like it had been quietly holding that value for 6 years in an appreciating neighborhood while my grandmother kept orchids on the windowsill downstairs and managed it alone at 88 and thought about me, apparently, enough to leave it to me and arrange, in whatever way she'd arranged it, for Gerald Okafor to be sitting at that table when I arrived. What do? I asked. I meant it practically. I meant, what is the actual sequence of steps? He pushed the legal pad across the table. We start here, he said. Update 3, the education. I drove back to Cincinnati that evening with more information in my head than I'd arrived with and a kind of low-grade vertigo that I recognized, from teaching, as the sensation of a student who has just understood something larger than they expected. What followed over the next 6 weeks was the most practical education of my adult life. Gerald had his own structure for it. He didn't dump everything on me at once. He taught the way someone teaches who has done it before, who knows which pieces need to come first and which questions you have to earn the right to ask. First, the contractor. His name was David Reyes, licensed, insured, in business since 1998, with a reputation in the Franklin County Permit Office that Gerald described as, "They don't roll their eyes when they see his name." Gerald walked me through the repair scope with David on a Tuesday morning in April. What was cosmetic, what was structural, what was urgent, what could wait 2 years. The bid came in at $21,400. It was honest. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I just trusted Gerald's trust in David, which was itself a lesson about how this industry actually functions. The financing was Gerald's second lesson. The property had equity. Eleanor had owned it free and clear for the last 9 years. I applied for a renovation loan secured against the duplex. $24,000 at 7.2%, 15-year term, monthly payment of $220. Gerald explained every line of the loan documents. He explained what "secured by the property" meant in plain terms. He explained what happened in scenarios I didn't want to think about and why I needed to think about them anyway. By the time I signed, I understood what I was signing. That sounds like a low bar. It is not a low bar. Ohio landlord-tenant law was the third lesson. He gave me a copy of the Ohio Landlord-Tenant Act and told me to read it the way I'd read something I expected to be tested on. Security deposits, collection, holding, itemized return within 30 days of lease termination. Repair obligations, what I owed tenants, what timeline, what documentation. Entry notice requirements. Lease clauses that protected me, lease clauses that courts had repeatedly voided, lease clauses I would be tempted to include and shouldn't. He helped me screen the tenant for the upstairs unit. She was 24, a nursing student at Ohio State, quiet and serious with stable income from her parents and an 18-month lease proposal that Gerald said was a good sign. People who want longer leases are people who intend to stay. We ran the standard background and credit checks. Her name was Priya. She moved in on May 15th. I have a framed photo on my desk from the day she signed her lease. Gerald in the kitchen, Priya across the table, me standing to the side trying to look like I knew what I was doing, which I mostly did by then. His own lease renewal was the fourth lesson. He agreed to $850 a month. Still below market, still a deal, still the arrangement he'd had with my grandmother adjusted modestly for inflation and for the fact that I was not my grandmother and needed to learn that a building needed to sustain itself. He explained his reasoning to me directly, which I respected. He could find a market-rate apartment, but he valued stability and a landlord who understood the building's history. I valued a tenant who had forgotten more about property management than I would know for years. We both understood the exchange we were making. That, he said, was the actual lesson. Market rate is a ceiling, not a target. A reliable tenant paying slightly below market is worth more than the theoretical tenant paying top dollar who you'll spend 6 months trying to evict. I wrote that down. I have it on a note card above my desk in Cincinnati. I look at it sometimes when I'm grading papers at 10:30 at night and I need to remember that I'm building something. Update 4. What 8 months looked like. By November, both units were occupied. Gerald at $850, Priya at $1,050. Monthly gross, $1,900. Renovation loan payment, $390 a month until I refinanced. Net monthly income, $1,510 before maintenance reserves, which Gerald had taught me to set at 8% of gross, so $152 a month into a separate account that I treated as untouchable. My student loans were gone by month 6. I used $18,000 of the renovation loan proceeds that hadn't gone to David Reyes. The bid came in slightly under projection, plus 4 months of net cash flow. I made the final payment on a Tuesday afternoon in October sitting in my car in the school parking lot. I had been carrying those loans for 11 years. 11 years of that specific weight, that specific low-grade awareness that I owed something to an institution that did not care about me. I sat there for probably 5 minutes doing nothing. Then I went back inside and taught a 6th-grade class how to use negative space, which felt, in that specific moment, like an unusually good metaphor. I drove to Columbus the first Saturday of every month. Gerald would make coffee. I would bring pastries from a place I'd found on High Street. We'd walk the building, exterior first, then both units with tenant permission, then the basement, and he'd show me what to look for and how to assess what I was looking at. Gutters, the south side was holding after David's repairs, but watch the north side in spring. Basement, there's a hairline crack in the northeast corner of the foundation that has been there since 2011 and has not changed. If it changes, call David before doing anything else. The heating system in the upstairs unit was original to a 2003 replacement and had probably 4 to 6 years left. Start budgeting. In December, the property appraised at $318,000 for a refinance I was exploring. My equity position, subtracting the $24,000 renovation loan, was $294,000. I held that number in my head for a week before I could quite believe it. I am a middle school art teacher with $4,200 in savings and a 2014 Honda Civic. 8 months ago, that was my complete financial picture. It is still most of my financial picture. But there is now a building in Columbus that belongs to me, that earns money while I'm teaching 6th graders to use negative space, that is worth nearly $250,000, and that was left to me by a woman I hadn't spoken to in 11 years. I am still figuring out how to be grateful enough. Update 5. The second property. 2 years after the certified letter, I used a cash-out refinance to pull $60,000 in equity from the duplex. Gerald had walked me through the mechanism over 3 separate Saturday mornings, how it worked, what it cost, what the correct use of the proceeds looked like, what the incorrect use looked like, and why people made that mistake. I was not going to make that mistake. I had been well taught. I used the $60,000 as a down payment on a single-family rental 3 blocks from the duplex. $229,000, 2 bedrooms, needed cosmetic work, floors, paint, bathroom fixtures, the kitchen cabinets that someone had painted over with a shade of beige that I will take to my grave as an example of a crime against color theory. The renovation, this time, I managed myself. I knew David. I knew the permit office. I knew what questions to ask and how to read the answers. Gerald came to the closing. He drove himself, which he always did. He told me once that people who assumed he needed rides had not thought carefully enough about who they were talking to. We walked through the empty house together. He checked windows, looked at basement joists, ran water in all 3 sinks, opened and closed every interior door, checking for settling. In the back bedroom, he crouched down and examined a section of baseboard that I hadn't noticed, pressed it gently, nodded. Previous owners had a leak here, he said. It's been repaired. But watch this corner in spring. He stood up, looked around the room. Your grandmother would have liked this one. I didn't cry. I took out my phone and photographed the empty living room, bare floors, afternoon light coming through the west window, the particular quality of a room that is waiting. I texted the photo to my mother with no caption. She called 30 seconds later. Maya, what am I looking at? I bought a house, Mom, I said. We own something now. She was crying. I had expected her to be crying. I had been expecting that call, I realized, for longer than I'd known about the duplex. Maybe for years, maybe since I was young enough to understand that we rented and other people didn't, and that the distance between those two facts was something I didn't have the tools to close. I had the tools now. I knew where they came from. Resolution. What stays? I didn't quit teaching. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories are supposed to end. The protagonist finds financial freedom and leaves the ordinary life behind, and the ordinary life was the problem all along. That's not what happened. I still teach art to middle schoolers. I still spend 40% of my professional time convincing 12-year-olds that they are not, in fact, terrible at drawing. I do not want to stop doing that. I am good at it. It matters in ways I can see directly, which is a quality I've come to value. But I have options I didn't have 2 years ago. That's the honest version of the ending. Not transformation, expansion. The world I can move through is larger than it was on a Thursday afternoon in March when I almost threw away a certified letter because I assumed it was a collections notice. I asked Gerald once why he'd helped me. We were sitting at his kitchen table. We'd moved to a different table by then, a nicer one he'd bought at an estate sale on North 4th Street and refinished himself, and I'd been thinking about it for a while and I finally just asked. He thought about it for a moment. Put down his coffee cup. Eleanor asked me to look out for you if anything ever happened, he said. She knew you'd come. I sat with that. My grandmother and I didn't speak for 11 years. We didn't speak at her death. We didn't speak at any point in between, and I know, I've thought about this more than I can easily describe, that some of that was her, and some of it was me, and some of it was the particular stubbornness that runs in our family like a structural defect, present in every generation, expressing differently in every room. But she kept this building for 31 years. She maintained it, imperfectly, at the end alone. She rented to a retired property manager at below market rates for reasons that I now understand were not simply generosity, they were also insurance. She left me a building and a person who knew what to do with it, and she trusted that the building would hold its value long enough for me to arrive, and she trusted that Gerald would be at the door when I knocked. That is the most complicated love I have ever received. It came with peeling paint and a cracked driveway and a window patched with duct tape, and it came with a legal pad covered in numbers written in a neat, unhurried hand, and it came with Saturday mornings and coffee and a retired property manager who spent 2 hours on a Saturday giving me information that a real estate agent would have let me sell without ever having. I still drive to Columbus the first Saturday of every month. I still bring pastries from the place on High Street. Gerald and I still walk the buildings, both of them now, the duplex and the single family on the next street, the one with the repaired leak in the back bedroom baseboard. He's 70 now. He moves a little more carefully in the basement stairs. He still notices things I miss. Last month he found a slow drip under the upstairs kitchen sink in the duplex, a fitting connection that had been working its way loose for months. We caught it before any damage. He looked at it, looked at me, raised one eyebrow. "You would have caught it in 2 more weeks," he said. "Would I?" "Yes," he said. "You know what you're looking for now." He is right. I know what I'm looking for now. I know what questions to ask and how to read a bid and what a fair lease looks like and what an unreliable foundation crack looks like versus a stable one and what a neighborhood looks like when it's quietly becoming something. I know these things because a woman I didn't speak to for 11 years trusted that I was worth teaching, and because the man she trusted to teach me showed up on a Saturday morning with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee and 2 hours he didn't have to give me. I was 1 phone call away from listing it for $190,000. I was 1 signed contract away from paying off my loans and going back to Cincinnati and thinking I'd been smart, and I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing what I didn't know. The difference between that version of my life and this one is a certified letter I almost threw away and a man who opened a door and said, "She talked about you." My grandmother talked about me. After 11 years of silence, she talked about me to the person she trusted most in that building, on that street, in that neighborhood that was quietly becoming something. She left me a building and a lesson and a person to teach it, and she did it without ever having to say she was sorry or hear me say I was sorry, which was perhaps the only way it could have worked, given who we both were, given that stubbornness that runs in the family, given everything. The orchid on Gerald's windowsill bloomed again in February. He texted me a photo. I have it saved. I don't know if I deserved any of this. I know I showed up when I was supposed to, and I listened when I was supposed to, and I did the work, imperfectly, and kept doing it. I know that my mother cried on the phone when I told her we owned something. I know that my students sometimes ask me what I did over the weekend, and I tell them I was in Columbus checking on my buildings, and I watch them process that. A teacher with buildings, a teacher who owns something, and I think about what it means to let someone see that a thing is possible. We own something now. We built something, out of a building that was already there, waiting. That's not luck. That's not magic. That's a woman who kept a building for 31 years, and a man who knew what it was worth, and a morning when I sat down and listened instead of running. I'm still learning. Gerald would be the first to tell you I have more to learn. That's fine. I know what I'm looking for.